Well, welcome to Rural Strong Live, today presented by Nutrien. Our special guest is Mike Howell, Senior Agronomist from Nutrien. He's the host of the great program, The Dirt, which you can hear here weekly on Rural Strong Radio and the Tractors and Troubadours radio show and podcast. And Mike, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Brent. Glad to be with you today.
How you been?
It's been a busy year, running all over the world, it seems like.
Well, as we have heard the reports here, just about everywhere, crops are in the ground now. We're in these the important stages of development here. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about today is agriculture's fourth major nutrient, sulfur. And Mike, it's one that you spent a lot of time thinking about and sharing about here lately.
Yeah, we have done several episodes on sulfur over the course of the dirt. We did one in the first season, just introducing sulfur and the need for sulfur, and then we had a chance to go to the Sulfur World Symposium this year and learned a lot more about sulfur and highlighted sulfur on a couple of episodes this year.
Well, we hear so much talk about the need for NPK, but not so much about the need for sulfur. Why do you think that is?
Brandon, until recently, we kind of got sulfur free. It was an emission, basically a pollutant coming out of a lot of our factories, and it was in the air. When I was a kid, you couldn't turn the television on without hearing some news broadcast about acid rain, and that's what it was. There was sulfur in the atmosphere that caused that acid rain, and the good side of that is in that acid rain, we got the sulfur coming down into our crops, and we didn't have to apply a lot of sulfur, but since the Clean Air Act back in the Nixon administration, we really did a good job of cleaning up the emissions coming out of these factories. We don't have all of this sulfur being put back into the atmosphere, but that's necessitated the need for more sulfur fertilizer in our crops to supply that demand.
Well, I guess we should start at the kind of at the basics at the beginning here. How do crops use sulfur?
Crops use sulfur for a lot of different functions. One of the main functions of sulfur in the crop is an essential part of amino acids and protein production. We have to have the sulfur, and it works with other nutrients like nitrogen in forming these amino acids and proteins. Another function of sulfur, and a lot of people don't realize this, is it's important for stomatal regulation. The stomates, like the pores on your skin, regulate the water coming out of those plants. When it gets really hot, they'll open up and let some water out to cool that plant. But sulfur plays an important role in regulating those openings, and because of that, it can lead to some drought tolerance. If we have our sulfur levels right and in the right proportions with other nutrients, crops are able to withstand drought a lot better. And that's the last few years, that's an important topic that has gone around the entire country.
All right. Well, tell us a bit about how sulfur moves in the soil.
Sulfur works a lot like nitrogen in the soil. It is mobile in the soil. It really stays tied up in organic matter. If you're in some areas that have high organic matter, up to about 99% of the sulfur is actually going to be held in that organic matter. Now, if you're in areas like I am here on the Gulf Coast, we really don't have a lot of organic matter, and there's not a lot of holding power in those soils. But one of the main ways we can lose this sulfur in the system is just like nitrogen. We can lose it through leaching. We can get sulfate leaching when we get a heavy rain, especially on these sandy soils, and it'll move that sulfur down into the profile so that the plant roots can't get it.
And as you do that, tell us a bit about how the sulfur is transported in plants.
Within the plants, the sulfur is taken up in the soil solution. It'll move up into the plant roots through the xylem and move up into the plants. Once it gets into the plants, there's some transporters, and that gets way over my level of understanding in a hurry. But there's active transporters within the plants that are going to move that into the cells where it's needed.
And we talked a bit about the relationship to nitrogen. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sulfur works hand in hand with nitrogen, We've talked about it on the program several times. We have to keep that nitrogen and sulfur ratio in balance. Crops are going to need about a 12 to 1 ratio, up to a 16 to 1 ratio, depending on the individual crops. But we need to keep that ratio in place in order for both nutrients to work properly. If we apply nitrogen and don't have enough sulfur, the plants aren't going to be able to take up the nitrogen. If we apply sulfur and don't have enough nitrogen, the plants aren't going to be able to take up the sulfur. So they work hand in hand. We have a lot of nitrogen fixing crops out there. Our things like soybeans, our legume crops, they use the rhizobia in the soil to produce that nitrogen. Without adequate sulfur, these plants aren't able to fix the nitrogen. So we're not taking full advantage of that as well. Some other things about sulfur. We have low sulfur levels in our wheat, excuse me, and we look at this Midwest area that grows a lot of wheat. If we're not providing our sulfur nutrition, have the sulfur low, we can get into some poor baking qualities when we start using that wheat to make bread. And there's a lot of information about that. Actually can cause some carcinogenic effects because of some of the chemicals that are in that if we don't have enough sulfur in there. But the bread doesn't rise properly. It kind of gets crunchy instead of soft bread like we like to eat. The proper ratio of sulfur and nitrogen has also been shown to increase fertilizer recovery. If we keep that ratio right, we're recovering more of our other nutrients because the ratios are correct. And we already talked about the inefficiency of nitrogen being taken up if we don't have the sulfur there with it. So sulfur is critical, and that's one of the reasons we're focusing on that as the fourth major crop nutrient.
Well, you and I go to a lot of farm shows and conferences and conventions, and there's always a lot of talk at those events about increasing yield. Everybody wants to increase yield, but as we see yields increase and we see improvements with plant hybrids and input technologies, with those increasing crop yields, that's putting a strain on the soil. What does that do to the presence of sulfur in the soil?
Well, increasing crop yields is a necessity. The world population keeps going up. The amount of cropland is constantly going down. Urban sprawl is ongoing and taking farmland out of production. So we have to increase these yields in order to feed this growing population. If we look at the farmer side of this, they naturally want to increase yields because that's what drives their bottom line. They have to have profit to keep doing this, and yields is what's paying the bills for them. But you ask how does this affect the soil? With increased production, you have to increase the amount of food supply. I'm a pretty big guy, and I didn't get this way by eating just a little bit of lettuce. I like a steak and a potato and that kind of stuff as well. So crop nutrition is much the same way. We have to feed it a balanced diet. It needs all of these nutrients, but the more we're putting into that plant, naturally, the more we're taking out of the soil. So constantly increasing yield, removing more and more yield from a given field every year. We're also removing those nutrients. But it's important to understand what nutrients we're removing, and we have to replace those nutrients every year. And a lot of times that's in the form of commercial fertilizer.
Well, aside from soil samples, which is really kind of setting the baseline for everything we know about what's in the soil and how crops are going to grow here, what are some of the telltale signs that your crops are lacking in sulfur?
Before I get into that, I appreciate you mentioning soil samples. That's something we've focused a lot of emphasis on this year, on not only on the dirt program, but in a lot of our talks around the country as well. Fertilizer prices earlier in the year were as high as they've ever been. We really encourage growers to take soil samples. That's the true way to know what's going on in your soil. Make sure you have those nutrients right. And it's a lot easier to get those nutrients right before you plant. It's always easier to supply that pre-plant than to try to come back and fix a problem later in the year. If we do run into some problems later in the year, we can use some tissue samples along with the soil samples to help identify what's going on in that crop, understand where our deficiencies may be, and make some corrections then. But you asked specifically about what signs we can see in the crops. one thing that I always look for in crops, I look for that yellow coloring. A lot like nitrogen, you'll start seeing a general yellowing across the field, or within certain areas that may not be getting the sulfur it needs. But how it differs from nitrogen, if you're looking at a nitrogen deficiency, that's going to start at the lower part of the plant and move up. If you're looking at a sulfur deficiency, that usually starts at the top of the plant and moves down. So that's how we determine that difference from nitrogen deficiency in the field. Of course, if we start seeing that, that's when we start wanting to do some tissue samples and confirm what we're seeing and things like that.
So
there was something else I wanted to say about that, and I just lost my train of thought. Maybe I'll think of it and come back to it in a minute.
Well, I'll throw you another question, and by all means, feel free to interject if you think of that. In episode 11 of The Dirt, you talked about the use of agricultural sulfur as a fertilizer, fungicide, or soil amendment. Can you elaborate on each of those?
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that sulfur has a lot of different properties. Naturally, we think about it as a fertilizer, and we've talked a lot about that already today. The importance of sulfur fertilization. It's the fourth major crop nutrient, and it's vital in terms of amino acid and protein production, and working with nitrogen to make this happen. Elemental sulfur does have some fungicidal properties. A lot of times in grapes out in the California area, they'll use elemental sulfur to help control things like powdery mildew in those grapes, and it works in some other crops as well, and really good at doing that. We can also use sulfur as a form of a soil amendment. Now, in our part of the world, one of the big things is gypsum. We'll put that out as a soil amendment on peanuts, really trying to supply that calcium, but the sulfur in there helps to make that soil more friable, kind of crumbly up a little bit, so that it makes it easier to harvest these peanuts when we get them out of the ground. And it also helps with the permeability by making that soil, the soil properties a little better. We can actually get more water into the soil in times of dry weather. And we can also use elemental sulfur out west. They use it a good bit to help remove sodium from the soil. So they have problems with high sodium, and they can put the gypsum out, the calcium in that reacts with the sodium, and then we can actually leach that out of the soil. Soils with high pH can also have elemental sulfur applied to them to help lower that pH. It's got an acidifying property and will actually lower that pH. So a lot of uses for sulfur in agriculture.
So with that increased agricultural usage, are there any heightened risks to the soil or to the water supply?
Hey, if we over apply any nutrient, we can run into some problems. We want to always want to keep the 4 R's in mind. We want to practice that and make sure we put these nutrients out at the right rate, using the right source at the right time, and in the right amount. So make sure we get those nutrients out there when we need them, so the plants can most effectively take those up. The big problem we can see with too much sulfur is that sulfate can be converted into sulfide, which is just another form of that nutrient. And that can be toxic to some organisms in the water. So we don't want to get that sulfide into our lakes and streams and things like that. But by practicing the 4 R's and making sure we keep those nutrients in the field and going into the crops where they need to go, we really can reduce that risk and not have a problem with that. We just need to make sure we're using them properly. Another thing, and this goes back a long time, back to my high school days. You may have some water sometimes that if you have a hot water tank that you don't use a lot and turn that water on, it'll have a rotten egg smell. That's sulfur in that water, and you're able to smell that. But that it's really not going to hurt you, but it doesn't taste real good. So that's how you can tell that you've got too much sulfur in your water if you ever start getting that rotten egg smell.
Well, you mentioned earlier you recently attended the Sulfur World Symposium. Tell us about that event and also about some of your key takeaways from it.
And the Sulfur World Symposium took place in Edinburgh, Scotland. That was a great event. This year we had the first ever agronomy symposium. We had some researchers from around the world that gave some great presentations about sulfur and sulfur nutrition, the need for sulfur, and why it was needed to be promoted more as the fourth major crop nutrient. we got to do a lot of things. I actually got to go around the countryside and visit with a few farmers out there as well, and learn about production practices in Scotland. But there at the conference, we had a lot of speakers that talked about sulfur nutrition. My colleague Alan Blaylock was there and talked about the increased amount of sulfur that's going out these days, and how that could be bad, and talked about ways that we could manage that sulfur and make sure that we're not creating a pollutant. There was another speaker there that talked about the importance of sulfur and nitrogen. We had a physiologist there that talked more about how the sulfur moves in the plant and things like that. So a lot of valuable information came out of that meeting.
So, in terms of what Nutrien offers to help growers, what can you tell us about that?
Well, obviously, Nutrien is one of the leading suppliers of fertilizers in the world. By producing these fertilizers and making them available to growers, we're helping them be more productive through the fertilizers. Now, that's just one thing that we do. Another thing is our expert advice. We have agronomists. There's myself. There's Dr. Alan Blaylock, that's based in Colorado. We have Lyle Cowell. That's today is actually his first day. As a matter of fact, he's probably starting his first day today. He's based in right now. He's based in Canada, and we'll be covering that Canadian area. And then Dr. Carl Wyatt is our director of agronomy, and he travels across the world making presentations and providing educational information. So you have access to our expert system. We have educational opportunities, whether that be in webinars like we're doing today. We do these through various outlets, things like the American Society of Agronomy. We'll put on our own webinars from time to time. We do a lot of grower meetings around the country. We'll work with our retail cooperators and bring a group of growers in and talk about plant nutrition and how they can more effectively manage their fertilizer programs. Of course, we do the Dirt podcast, and we try to get out great information on that. And we have our eKonomics website as well. Now, if you've never been to the eKonomics website, that's Nutrien-eKonomics with a K.com. And that's a great source of information. We're not trying to promote any of our products on there. We're just giving research-based information, scientific information about soil fertility and fertilizers, general agronomy. A lot of information on that website. We also have a rainfall tracker. No matter where you are, you can highlight your farm and get a really good, accurate estimate of rainfall totals over an extended period of time. We have a growing degree calculator, so you can figure out how many growing degrees or heat units your crop has accumulated during the growing season. That works off of some weather satellites around the country. Really great information there. The nutrient removal calculator is another one. You can use that you can plug in your crop, your yield, soil fertility levels, and figure out how much of these nutrients are actually being taken off when you harvest this crop. Give you an idea of how much you may need to put back to replace those nutrients. So a lot of really valuable information on that website.
And you've kind of beefed up the area on sulfur here. We've got a lot of assets that talk directly about sulfur.
We do. Naturally, we've got the links to our podcast on there. We've done, I think, 3 episodes so far this year focusing strictly on sulfur and sulfur nutrition. We've got research about sulfur. If you go into the agronomics tab there, you'll find a lot of research reports on sulfur. We've got some tools in there talking about sulfur management guidelines, how growers can use sulfur to help increase their productivity and profitability. And what you have highlighted on the screen now is really new. I think this just came out last week. This is from the Sulfur Institute. The Agronomic Advisory Committee put a lot of work into developing some nutrient use guides for several crops. And we have a link to these on the eKonomics website as well. And there's more of these to come in the future. So some really good information out there on sulfur and sulfur nutrition.
Well, when you talk about those episodes of the Dirt that you guys have done in dealing with sulfur, in addition to what we've already covered here today, what else will folks hear when they go listen to those episodes?
Well, one thing we're doing right now is a famous person in agriculture or agronomy. We try to highlight somebody that's made a big contribution to the world of agriculture and spotlight them a little bit. So that's a little something different we're doing this year. As far as sulfur, we had our episodes from Scotland, and those guys really went a lot deeper than we can today, and a lot of really good information coming out of that. But we also talk about anything related to soil fertility and agriculture. We have some economic information if people are interested in what the commodity markets are doing. We have speakers on from time to time talking about that. Another popular segment is when we have our weather guy on, and he talks about the long range weather forecast, and he's pretty spot on with most of those predictions. So a lot of useful information on there.
Well, as things are starting to dry up again in parts of the country, that's very valuable information. So I hope everybody will be paying attention to that. Before we get out of here, I want to talk about an upcoming appearance. You mentioned Dr. Carl Wyant earlier. You and he are going to be at the Grand Farm Cultivate event. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, that's going to be up in Fargo, North Dakota. The Grand Farm is a place that companies such as Nutrien can go and put out research and demonstration trials, and they bring a lot of growers in to view those trials. We can talk about what's going on in those fields, and they have educational events from time to time during the year, and that's what's going on this week. Carl will actually be there, and he's going to be talking about sulfur and sulfur being the fourth major crop nutrient. He's going to go a little deeper and talk about how sulfur works and why we're seeing the need for sulfur more and more these days. So it should be a really good event. If you're in the area, that's going to take place on the Thursday morning, I believe.
Well, I tell you, one of the exciting things about where we are at this point in history, with each passing day, there's more and more education about this stuff that was probably not even available when you started in the business.
When I started, we had to drive 3 or 4 or 5 hours to get to a grower meeting and hear extension people talking about the latest and greatest developments. And today everything's just at a click of a button. We have access to anything on our phones or our tablets, and we can listen to information driving down the road or while we're out scouting the field or riding on the tractor. So never a shortage for ways to learn new information, and really appreciate people tuning in and getting more information. That's going to help everybody. If we're better stewards of the land and being more productive, that's going to help everybody down the road.
Well, that's one of the good things here is folks have more time on their hands as they happen to be doing their summer work, whether in a tractor or a sprayer or later in a combine. You're kind of a captive audience here, and the mobile side of the Nutrien eKonomics website is very accessible. It's very portable, and you can take it with you wherever you go. And you can listen to episodes of The Dirt with Nutrien and listen to Mike as you go about and get your agronomic education there.
Yep, and we've got a few exciting episodes. We're not going to talk a lot about that, but we have some road trips coming up, and I think everybody's really going to get excited when they hear some of the future episodes we have coming this year. So gonna get out of the field and get into some other areas, but really exciting stuff coming.
Well, we can't wait to hear it. And again, you can hear it on Rural Strong Radio, our 24/7 streaming radio station found at ruralstrongmedia.com or on the Live 365 streaming radio app. The Dirt with Nutrien can be heard Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays at 10 a.m. Eastern, and again on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern, with excerpts on each episode of the Tractors and Troubadours radio show and podcast, which comes out weekly. So a lot of opportunities to stay plugged in with what Mike and the team at Nutrien are doing. And Mike, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. It's been an honor to have you on the show. And I want to thank the rest of the team at Nutrien for being such an important sponsor of Rural Strong Media in our programming.
Brent, we really appreciate you working with us. Glad you had us on the show today. I hope we got some information out that your listeners can benefit from. And, it's a great partnership. We really appreciate you promoting our program and helping us get the word out about it.
Well, it's great education. And I'm not just a promoter of it. I'm also a fan of it. I love listening to these episodes. I can't wait for them to come out because I'm learning a lot.
Well, we really appreciate that.
Well, I tell you, I want to thank everybody for joining us today and invite you to get plugged in and be an active member of the Rural Strong community so you can hear Mike Howell in the Dirt and all of our great programming here. We'd also love for you to subscribe to the Tractors and Troubadours podcast. where each week we bring you agriculture industry newsmakers, hot button industry issues, educational features, and the best in traditional country music, Western swing, and bluegrass music. The Tractors and Troubadours podcast can be found wherever you get your podcasts, also at ruralstrongmedia.com. Come out 52 weeks a year, so be sure to subscribe. Leave us a rating and a comment and share it on the socials so we can continue to build the Rural Strong media presence. Also invite you to listen to Rural Strong Radio, which is found at ruralstrongmedia.com or that Live 365 streaming radio app. Each day we bring you Tractors and Troubadours, as well as the Bottom Line Report with Mark Oppold, Farm Gate with Stu Ellis, the Ag Law and Tax Report with Roger McMohan, and Beltway Beef from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And again, The Dirt with our friend Mike Howell. Again, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays at 10 a.m. Eastern and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. And we would love for you to take us with you wherever you go. When we're not playing our ag programming, we've got all that great traditional country music as we've got spinning right now there on Rural Strong Radio. So again, we want to say a special thank you to the folks at Nutrien for making this live stream possible. And friends and neighbors, the clock on the wall tells us it's time to get on out of here. So for Mike Howell, it's Brent Adams, Rural Strong Media, and the Tractors and Troubadours radio show and podcast. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, everybody.